Ethan had always been a skeptic. Growing up in a family that valued science and logic, he never believed in ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural. To him, the world was governed by natural laws that could be understood and explained through reasoning. So when his friends suggested a night of fun with a Ouija board, he didn't think twice before agreeing. After all, it was just a game, something to have fun and laugh about, nothing more. At least, that's what he thought. That night, Ethan and his friends gathered at Sarah's house, a close friend who had always been fascinated by everything paranormal. Her house was old, built in the late 19th century, with dark wooden walls and creaky floors. The candles lit around the room created an atmosphere perfect for what they were about to do, but to Ethan, it was all just for show. He sat around the table with the others, laughing at Sarah's attempts to create a spooky ambiance. The Ouija board was placed in the center of the table, its letters and numbers faintly glowing in the candlelight. The planchette, a heart-shaped piece with a small glass window in the center, was positioned on top. Sarah explained the rules, emphasizing that everyone should keep their fingers lightly on the planchette and never take their hands off during the session. Ethan, though skeptical, agreed and positioned his fingers on the piece, ready for what he considered a night of harmless fun. Sarah began the session with a soft, almost ceremonial voice, asking if there was any spirit present that wanted to communicate. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the sound of the breeze outside tapping against the windows. Ethan looked around the table, expecting someone to start moving the planchette to provoke a reaction, but everyone seemed focused and serious. That's when he felt the first vibration under his fingers. The planchette started to move slowly, as if it had a life of its own, gliding smoothly over the board's letters. Ethan tried to hide his discomfort, convinced that one of his friends was pushing the piece. However, as the planchette moved faster, forming words and answering Sarah's questions, he began to feel increasingly uneasy. The answers were short but direct, as if the spirit supposedly communicating was in a hurry. When Sarah asked for the spirit's name, the planchette quickly spelled out Caleb. No one knew anyone by that name, which only heightened the tension in the room. The session continued, and the questions became more personal. Sarah asked about future and past events, and the answers they received were eerily accurate. The atmosphere in the room had shifted, going from lighthearted fun to a seriousness that was almost palpable. Ethan felt a strange coldness, emanating from the board and spreading throughout the room. He started to feel unwell, as if something was draining his energy. He tried to ignore the feeling, but the discomfort grew. Then, things began to take a really strange turn. As the group continued to ask questions, the planchette started to move erratically, as if the spirit was becoming agitated. Suddenly, the piece moved quickly off the board, falling off the table with a hollow sound. Everyone in the room recoiled, surprised and frightened. The silence that followed was heavy, as if the air was charged with electricity. Ethan, trying to keep his composure, nervously laughed and suggested they continue, but the others seemed hesitant. Sarah, clearly disturbed, placed the planchette back on the board and tried to resume the session. She asked the spirit if it was angry, but there was no immediate response. Instead, everyone in the room started to hear a soft sound, almost like scratching, coming from the walls. The sound was low but constant, and it seemed to be moving around the room, as if something was inside the walls, trying to get out. Fear began to settle among the friends, and Ethan, who had maintained his skepticism up until then, started to feel a twinge of doubt. The sound grew louder, turning into a more intense scratching, accompanied by a slight tremor in the floor. Panic began to spread through the group, and someone suggested they stop the session. Sarah tried to end it, but before she could say anything, the candle lights went out all at once, plunging the room into total darkness. What happened next was chaos. Everyone started screaming, trying to find a way out in the dark. Ethan stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair in the process, and began desperately searching for a light switch. But before he could reach it, something made him stop. He felt a presence behind him, something he couldn't see, but that was undeniably real. A cold hand touched his shoulder, and Ethan turned sharply, but there was no one there. The lights came back on, but the atmosphere in the room was different. Everyone seemed shaken, and Sarah decided it was best to stop there. They quickly put the board away and tried to forget what had happened. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling he had, that cold hand on his shoulder, the scratching in the walls, and the presence he couldn't explain. He knew something had happened that night, something that defied his logical understanding. In the days that followed, Ethan began experiencing strange things in his own home. Objects he was sure he had left in one place would appear in another. At night, he heard inexplicable sounds, footsteps in the hallway, whispers in the dark, and a constant feeling of being watched. The skepticism he had held onto his entire life began to crumble, replaced by a fear he couldn't ignore. One night, while lying in bed, he felt the same presence he had felt at Sarah's house. The air around him grew cold, and he heard a faint whisper, as if someone was speaking directly into his ear. The words were indistinct but carried a sense of urgency. Ethan tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, a product of his mind trying to rationalize what had happened. But the feeling was so real, so tangible, that he knew it wasn't just a trick of the mind. Desperate, Ethan began researching the Ouija board and its supposed consequences. He discovered that in many cases, people who used the board experienced paranormal activity soon after. Some reports spoke of spirits attaching themselves to participants, following them wherever they went. Ethan didn't want to believe this could be true, but the evidence in his own life was hard to ignore. Eventually, he decided to seek help. He confided in a close friend, who was also a skeptic, about what was happening. Together, they investigated ways to get rid of the spirit, if there was one. They consulted a paranormal expert, who suggested that Ethan burn the board and perform some kind of purification ritual in his home. Ethan, desperate for answers, followed the instructions to the letter. He gathered his friends again, including Sarah, and explained what he had learned. With some trepidation, they agreed to participate in the ritual. On a cold, dark night, Ethan took the board to a secluded location and burned it, while reciting words he didn't fully understand, but that were recommended by the expert. The fire consumed the board quickly, and as the flames rose, Ethan felt as if a weight was being lifted from his shoulders. After that night, things began to improve. The strange activities in his house decreased, and the feeling of being watched started to fade. Ethan still couldn't explain what had happened, but he was relieved to finally be able to live in peace again. He knew he would never touch a Ouija board again, and that the experiences of that night had changed him forever. Despite everything, Ethan never told his parents or other friends about what happened. It was a story he preferred to keep to himself, a reminder that there are things in this world we may never fully understand. And though he had returned to embracing his skepticism, there was a part of him that would always remain on alert, aware that the unexplained could be lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again.